name's Katrina Navickas. I'm Senior Lecturer in History at the University of Hertfordshire. I'm using Adam's logo for our new centre we've just set up. Okay, so my research interest is in the Chartist Movement. So I'm going to give you a bit of history. We've not had any real history yet today, so that's my job as the historian. The Chartist Movement were the biggest movement for democracy in 19th century Britain, and I work on popular protest and social movements in that era. They campaigned for the vote for all men. We're not thinking about the suffragettes yet, that's later. We've got to get men the vote, I'm afraid, at this period. And they loved meetings. They really loved meeting. So this is one of the earliest daguerreotype or lithograph, I'm not sure which one it is, of a crowd in existence. It's in the Royal Collection, and it's of the big Chartist monster meeting, as they were called, on Kennington Common. And the Chartists held all these massive meetings across the country to campaign for the vote. But what they also did was hold regular weekly meetings, because Victorians love being in committees. And if you're anyone who's anyone, you sit on a committee and go to a meeting every week. So if you love doing that, then you're following on from the Victorians. They advertise these meetings in the newspapers. And so my main source is the Northern Star newspaper, which ran in the mid-19th century. And I wanted to know how many meetings are in the Northern Star newspaper. That's my research question. And luckily, they have a column where they advertise what the forthcoming meetings of that week is. And neatly, they're advertised by place. So it's a really regular form of information. So I thought, well, how can we use digital methods to calculate this for me and for the rest of the historical world? I've been doing this for about 10 years. But when I started, I had to use one of these. There's probably still quite a lot in this building. And even before then, I'm not allowed, I don't know if I'm allowed to use this word, but I used to go to this place called Colindale. I think that's been banned now. But I'm not a digital historian, even though on the programme it says I'm a lecturer in digital history. Adam's the lecturer in digital history, I'm not. I'm just a traditional historian. I learnt with pen and paper and microfilm and looking at archives. The material, we've heard quite a lot about the material today already. And so 10 years ago, how would I calculate how many meetings there were in the 19th century? I would go through the microfilm, or in fact, I used to not look at it in Callendale. I used to go to Huddersfield Local Studies to use their copy of the Northern Star, and I'd write it out on paper. And actually, most historians today still do it that way. So although we've now digitised the Northern Star, you can access it on the British Library collections, most historians accessing this material still do the old pen and paper trick and plot everything and collate everything in an analogue way. And that's still how we train historians, whether they're undergraduates or postgraduates or early career or senior lecturers like me. So I was really excited to become part of the British Library Labs, because I'm going through this process where I'm digitising myself and learning how to do this, not just accessing the information from the online system, which most people do now, but actually learning how to use the data myself and use new digital tools. So today my talk is a bit of a call to you as digital humanists and librarian and information scientists to think about how you engage with old school people like me. My colleagues were kind of thinking I'm some sort of digital genius learning this. I'm not. And a lot of them I find are quite scared of thinking about new ways of using the digital material. All my colleagues and all the students will use the newspaper archive online to get their information, and they'll use keyword searching to get what they want, but they don't really understand how it works. And they certainly don't, they feel quite scared about learning some of the language that digital humanists use. I'm trying to learn this. I first started thinking about digital history by following all the right people on Twitter. And again, I don't want to tread on toes here, but I think sometimes the digital humanities community tend to be a bit inward looking and actually use language that alienates some of the people that I deal with, both in terms of students and in terms of colleagues, who feel a bit scared about how to access this information and new ways of doing this. So I'm kind of feeling a bit of a guinea pig in getting involved with all this and trying to learn some coding, learn some programming, to try and make it a bit more accessible to people outside the people of this room who kind of know the language and know how that this isn't a scary place, actually. It's a really exciting place and a creative place. So I'm digitising myself. Ironically, I made my academic name by studying the Luddites. My very first journal article as a PhD student was on who were the Luddites, why did they hate machinery so much? So it's ironic now that I'm using digital tools all the time. But I think that following the path of the Luddites, we've got to actually not just make sure that people are using technology, but also are engaging with it themselves and using it to their benefit. So my project, the Political Meetings Mapper, is using the digital environments that the British Library provided me with, but also learning the tools and learning how to be a neo-Luddite. The neo-Luddites hate me, by the way. Really hate me. So I hope there's none here today, because they'll slag me off on Twitter. So it involved learning Python. I'm still not brilliant at it. Ben Osteen has helped me a lot in doing that. But I'm getting to this stage now where I spent 10 years trying to collate a load of data by hand from the newspapers. Now the current Python program, which you'll be able to access on GitHub, takes 2.5 minutes to collate a load of meetings. So you can take your choice which one you want to do, and that's what I'm learning to do. But it is a scary process. It's quite a challenging process, and I'm hoping that I can encourage more of the traditionally trained academics to do it as well. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a bit about the project now. It's called Political Meetings Mapper. My aims were to find how many meetings I could find in this one newspaper as a case study, but obviously the code will be available and you'll be able to use it for any digitised newspaper, hopefully. I'm also really interested in maps. Although I started off as a historian, I now spend my time going to geography conferences. So I'm moving into geography. I love maps, they're great. And the British Library have got a brilliant collection of maps. So I wanted to map where are those meetings held. Can we tell anything from the spatial positions of where meetings happen? Do they happen in one place in a town? Do they happen in one town and not another town, and why not? Those are my big research questions that I'll be doing till I'm 70 when I've been told to retire. And also a more sort of information science question about, can we find where those meetings are in the digitised newspapers automatically? At the moment the project started, I was having to identify them manually by hand. Dear Python, here's the image with the meetings on it. We're currently developing, can we identify those automatically in the newspaper where it says, here's a meeting. The sources are the newspapers, the georeferenced historic maps, and also some playbills, because a lot of meetings happen in theatres. So I'm trying to combine some of the British Library collections together, and we're all about linked data today. So here's how it went. So the first thing we needed to do was get some clean OCR of the images. The initial sort of setup, we thought we were going to have to crowdsource the transcription of the newspapers. But I thought, let's run it through the latest edition of Abbey Fine Reader, which is the OCR software. And it was amazing. This was completely unexpected, that we didn't actually have to crowdsource the transcription whatsoever. This was fantastic. Actually, Abbey Find Reader were coming up with about 80% accuracy. So all we needed to do was to get one volunteer who's in the room, Sam, who's a graduate of our university, to just check. And it was mainly punctuation errors. Actually, in terms of the words, most of them were accurate. It was fantastic. I didn't expect this at all, which shows you just how far the OCR recognition software is developed by now. It helps that the newspaper is in the same type all the time and that the data's pretty regular. So I don't know how it would cope if it was a newspaper that had lots of images in it, for example, whereas the Victorian newspapers don't have images just yet. So you've got the images of the newspaper column on the left and the bottom, and the OCR. Brilliant. That's all we needed to do for that. So no need for all the crowdsourcing, although we've heard a lot about crowdsourcing already, so I'm not going to talk about it. The next stage was to geocode the information. So we developed a Python code to extract the place names. Again, it helped that the place names were at the beginning of each line, so it's quite easy to recognise. We built a gazetteer, basically just running those place names through one of the online gazetteers to get the coordinates. The amazing thing about doing history that geographers forget is that a lot of places don't exist anymore, thanks to the French and then the Germans and then people like post-war planners and who like building motorways. So the interesting job for me, and the job that I enjoyed the most, is trying to geocode places that don't exist anymore. So basically we just georeferenced some old maps and did it manually that way, layering them on Google Earth. That's quite fun because you can go, oh, there's a motorway there, and there wasn't, obviously, in the 1840s. So that's how we did that. So we did have to manually do some of the addresses, but that seemed to work okay. Then the next step was to date them. So we used some regular expressions to date the meetings. We've got that again on the GitHub. It's particularly important for date expressions like tomorrow or yesterday. So we used a bit of natural language processing to work that out. Again, it helped that the newspaper always came out on a Saturday, so you kind of had a base date. So when it said there was going to be a meeting on Monday, you could calculate that quite easily because the newspaper was always on a Saturday. So it's quite regular data, so it's actually fairly easy to do. So that's the process that the code goes through. It's a bit rough and ready on, so if you do go on the GitHub page, it's a bit of a mess. I'm sorting it out this week, apologies, but it's mostly there. So what did we find? Okay, I didn't know how many meetings there were going to be. We took a sample of the newspapers from 1841 to 1844, so 4 years worth. I'm going to carry on doing this in my spare time, again on the train. It's quite relaxing to do on my long train journeys to Hatfield every day. But in the 4 years, we found 5,519 meetings. Okay, it's not quite big data, but it's for a historian, that's a lot. I couldn't have done that by hand. And counting. So they just come out in a CSV file. Again, apologies, it's in Excel. I can see some horrid faces, but I'm a historian. So it comes out with the newspaper text, the place, the coordinates, the date of the newspapers, and also the date of the meeting that is calculated. There's 462 towns and villages so far. Again, these will carry on going up. So showing you that it's all across the country. There's the Chartists also like doing lecture tours. So we plotted where the lectures went. And again, this is all on the website, which I'll show you in a minute. So Chartist lecturers were paid to go around and proselytise about this strange new idea called democracy. And they went round, and so we've been able to plot those because they advertise their speaking engagements. So that's great. That's already useful for me as a historian. Probably not that useful for you, but I'm really interested in it. So all the data is on the website. I was busy sorting it out last night. So it's politicalmeetingsmapper.co.uk. Again, it's a bit basic because it's on the Omeka platform. We thought that Omeka would be the best way of doing it because that seems to be one way of trying to make a standard online exhibition platform. I found it a bit limiting. So at the moment, if you do a search, you can't export that search as a CSV file for some reason. And when you look on the queries of the Omeka developers, they said they're not going to develop that feature. So if you want to, please bombard them with emails to make them do that. But Political Meetings Mapper is the platform, and we placed some layers of historic maps on there. I think I might quickly just see if I can show you the website. There we are. So that's what it looks like. You can see a map of all the meetings, and you can zoom in and see where they all are by place. It's most of the UK. They're obviously concentrated in the north because that's where the paper is, but there's quite a lot in London as well. And you can play around. I'll leave you to play around with that in your own time. There's also some exhibits with the lecture tours on, for example. So you can follow these people around where they went and that so forth. So that's the kind of the website with it all on, which is great fun. And again, I'll try and make it a bit more user-friendly once I've sorted out everything on it. So now we move on to more fun stuff and some of the research results. What we found actually was a lot of London venues. I'm not a historian of London. As you can tell, I don't come from round here. So I don't know. I didn't know anything about London Chartism. I do now. Because what we found was that a lot of the venues advertised in the paper were from London. So we decided to plot those on maps, and we found that it was all over London. And not just in central London, but across London, and places that weren't actually part of London, but are now, even Croydon. I'll stand up for Croydon because that's where I live. The Rising Sun was a Chartist venue. It's now Morrison's local. So if I zoom in, the yellow blob is where the British Library is. This is a slightly earlier map, so hence it's all fields around here. But there's some interesting things. The British Library is situated on the site of a pub called the Cheshire Cheese. And the Cheshire Cheese was a Chartist pub. So when you leave the building, if you're going out the back entrance, please pay your respects to the many Chartists who held meetings on this site. And we found lots of other venues around and about. That's what it looks like in terms of a heat map of the locations. So most of them are actually in the West End, Soho area. There's quite a lot in the East End. So if you imagine Chartists with their sort of big furry beards and tweeds and riding a penny farthing, oh no, that's the hipsters of Shoreditch. So there were actually a lot of Chartist meetings in Shoreditch and Hackney, so proto-hipsters there. And also in the south of the river in the Southwark area. So this is really useful information for us as historians to find out the concentrations in London. You can also plot it on all different types of maps. That's William Booth's map of, Charles Booth's map of poverty in London. So you can plot these meeting sites against areas of deprivation or not. So the bluer, darker areas are places where there were classified as poorer people living. Some quite interesting work that I can do now on London history and Chartism in London, which has actually been neglected as a topic in history debates so far. So that's the history. Got to sort of think about other things, again, something I'd not really heard of as a historian, but I now know quite a bit about because Ben Osteen's been trying to teach me, banging his head against the wall because I don't understand it. But we've been trying to classify meetings. We've done it with the clean OCR and it works. So you can now find examples, mainly looking at punctuation and where the capital letters are, and so forth. But we're also going to trial it on the unreconstituted XML that the British Library has in their collection as well. Can we find meeting data in that, which is a lot more difficult and is going to need a lot more refining. So we are continuing to build a classifier. Okay, so that's the technical stuff. We are sort of thinking about what to do next. I'll keep feeding in data. If you've got any other suggestions about what we can do with it, I'd much appreciate it, but we're going to carry on sort of doing some more refining of the parsing of the dates. We haven't yet connected the adverts of what's on this week in the meetings world with reports of those meetings in the next issue of the newspaper. That I think that'll be really handy for students and historians. So it'll say, here's a meeting at the Cheshire Cheese next week, and then you get the report connected with it as well. We'll do some more machine learning on the XML. I'm also working with UCL with their space syntax lab about can we analyse this more in more detail geographically. I think that's going to be really exciting. I'm going to be doing that on Manchester, which is the greatest city in the world, rather than London, because London's too big. But London was where we were based, so I decided, as you've heard already, to do an event, a public engagement event, to get people thinking about what might it be like to be a Chartist. So we did a Chartist tour of London last September, and we're just going to hopefully have a short video of the reenactment. It was a pouring down rain, but I'd like to thank Sam, who's in the room, Fabian's who's in the room, who's on there. There's quite a few faces that are in here that you'll have to look round and see if you can spot. Also, Rudy, my PhD student, who is a wonderful actor, as you'll see. 40s. So today we've organised an event which is looking at some of the meeting sites in London. On Sunday evening last, the Chartist meeting at the Feathers, Warren Street, in accordance with a previous resolution, commenced delivering a series of lectures on political subjects. Some of these pubs and other sites, trying to sort of picture in our minds what the Chartists were like by going into some of these venues. So I'm trying to bring history to life. We're in Soho now, and this is the Two Chairmen, which is now called the Crown and Two Chairmen, and it was the central meeting place for the journeymen tailors who had a Chartist branch in the 1840s. We're now at the Red Lion pub in Soho, and we've just walked all the way from the British Library, and this is our final destination.
I have stood forward, both in and out of the House of Commons, battling all parties who dare to arrest the people in their onward course of liberty. I thank you.
I think I've learned a lot from this experience, going to the actual sites, seeing how long it takes to get from one to the other on foot. And I think we've got a flavour of early Victorian London. I second the resolution. I am happy to say that the cause of English radicals has met with the sympathy of the Irish Chartists.
Hooray!
So please, show of hands for the resolution. Carried unanimously. Okay. So, thanks to all my helpers, particularly thanks to Sam Walkden, who's here today, who was my student to check the OCR, and thanks to the BL Labs team. If anyone from the BL Labs team's here, I've left a Bassett's licorice all sorts in the office, and Hannah's got it, so please take some off her, otherwise she'll eat them all. And thanks also to the National Library of Scotland for letting us use their map on the website as well, and we've also got some British Library maps there. My final point is I do have a book out. Sorry, it's sort of hijacking it. I'm going to put some flyers out on the table where you can actually buy it for its ridiculously academic price. But there will be a Kindle version available. So if you want to learn more about the Chartists, then my book's out on the 1st of December. Thanks.
for a couple of quick questions.
In your talk, you mentioned like that sometimes the digital side can be quite inward-looking and perhaps not reaching out enough. And I guess that's an area that I'm very interested in terms of how do we offer the ability to gain the skills to the people who don't have them, and perhaps find it difficult to take that step into gaining those skills. What are the venues, the methods, the routes that you think would be successful there? Kind of, you said in your talk, like you had this comparison of, this took me so many years to do by hand, and we can do something that's similar, I guess not exactly the same, with machine very much quicker. That I find doesn't always win you arguments, because it's like, because what you've got is a black box to people who don't know what's happening, and that's very, that's not very good scholarship, I guess, from their perspective. Then, do you have any views on what can be done there to improve that outreach?
I think there's so many different ways in which you can approach it. I mean, we have a digital history centre at Hertfordshire, and we actually teach undergraduates to use digital methods. So I think it's partly convincing academic historians that digital methods are useful and are actually available to them. So my colleague Adam, who you've heard already, set up the Programming Historian, which is a brilliant website for training, which I find really accessible as well. So I think you've just got to approach it at various different levels. Actually just publicise the fact that digital humanities is now kind of part of what we do as a historian or an English lit scholar or whoever, that it's not something separate, that it's got to be part of it, but also just making them think about the fact that the language is actually sometimes a bit scary, and you've got to sort of, I know everyone likes the buzzwords, but actually the buzzwords are a bit intimidating for people who are not used to, who are not trained in that. So also allowing sort of opportunities for training, so whether it be at undergraduate level or sort of career development level, to actually just break down those barriers, I think. I mean, we're getting there. I think it's probably more resistance on the academic side rather than the DH side. And it's just a sort of, maybe it'll take a few generations to really sort of integrate everyone into the digital world.
I just wondered, you mentioned that some of your colleagues were somewhat reticent in using it. Personally, having gone through this procedure, have you seen or noticed any difference? Have they learnt from what you've experienced?
I think they're trying to see how I get on with it. I mean, I don't think they... I think they saw me getting really frustrated when I'm trying to understand what the Python code's doing. It's hopefully I'm trying to sort of persuade people that they should at least have a go. So I did I'm more au fait with geographical information systems, which is again something I taught myself because traditional academic history teaching doesn't teach that. And trying to teach a group of senior to me to use geographic information systems was quite a challenge on my sort of part as well. But then once they got it, they said, oh yeah, okay, this is actually quite useful. We can think about analysing space in new ways. And I think it's just a sort of persuading people to have a go. Which is what I've done, and they've seen me tear my hair out as well. So I don't know if that's a positive contribution or not.
Hi, you mentioned about re-OCRing I suppose it's a sample of the 19th century newspapers, not the whole lot. Has that better quality OCR text now been re-ingested into the main resource, do you know? No,
I think because the main resource is still relying on the XML, which is awful. It's really bad because it was done, 10, 15 years ago. So that's why we did the re-OCRing, because we needed to then work out, we needed something quickly, and that's why it was quickly done. So it hasn't been fed back in. They're just in text files at the moment. But that's why we're developing the machine learning aspect to see if we can at least develop some sort of code for recognising these meetings in the XML, even though the XML is quite poor.
So I just make a comment about that question, if I could. So one of the interesting side effects of this project is to have done that exercise, because I think we've had a suspicion that it's about time to think about redoing the OCR of some of our historic digitized material. And I think this has confirmed our suspicion that there's a substantial improvement and that it would have an impact on researchers rather than just be, better text. And so that leaves a potential for work to be done, at least potential for money to be found. Unfortunately, given the tens of millions of pages that we'd be talking about, but this is, I think, an important, Katrina's project is an important contribution to our understanding that.
I'm really interested in this project. I think it does serve to make Chartism much more explicable and accessible. I wondered if you envisaged any enhancement of the project to look at the Chartist press, of which the Northern Star is clearly a good example. You seem to be mining the content, but not really thinking very much about the medium. And I wondered what you thought about that.
It's not my expertise, really, in terms of that's more in kind of linking where the Chartists, I'm right, linking where the Chartists publish things and how they publish things. Is that what you're getting at?
Even the Northern Star as a facet of the Chartist press.
Yeah.
It's got other categories besides meetings.
Oh, yeah.
Reports, I mean, I'm just thinking about it as the medium from which you're, the context in which you're drawing this.
Yeah. And, the Northern Star's just a case study, and of course we can expand that to lots of different newspapers, not just Chartist ones, obviously, but any sort of type of newspaper. But in terms of the content, what makes it a specifically Chartist newspaper, in the fact that it's got all these records of all the meetings, but it's also got sports news and what exhibitions are on that, and what might be, I think you might be able to sort of then try and classify what might be of interest to Chartists, or at least who the editors think are reading this, and work out, okay, well, obviously they're going to be interested in Chartist meetings. They might also be supporters of Sheffield Wednesday or something. I mean, obviously they're not, because they didn't exist in them, but, that kind of working out a bit more in terms of the softer content rather than the political content. So, yeah, definitely.